Hello. Good. Oh, as per usual, we obviously are having some technical issues. Hello, let's try that again. Hello, good evening, good morning, depending on where you are in the world. Apologies for that start. Obviously, the way the world is at the moment, technology is not the easiest thing to use all the time, and things always are going to go wrong. So bear with us tonight, but hopefully it will still be a really enjoyable evening. This is tonight's Pint of Science that we're going to get on with very shortly. And although we can't be in a pub with you tonight, I hope you're still able to enjoy our speakers and have got a drink in hand, whatever your poison of choices, whether it is some ginger beer or, like myself, ready to drink my gym bramble once this is finished. So my name is Dr. Jenna Kenyani. I am a woman in her 30s with olive skin, dark eyes, and long brown hair, and I'm currently sat in my living room with a green wall and a bookcase behind me, for those of you that may not be able to see me today. And I'm from the University of Liverpool, and I'll be your host this evening. So firstly, before we get started, I just wanted to let you know that if you need closed captions, that you can do this using Google Chrome, and you can go to Settings, Advanced Accessibility and Live Captions. Hopefully one of my colleagues behind the scenes will be able to post that on the YouTube chat comments, so you'll all be able to access that. Now, secondly, I was going to say, but we've already been through this, please bear with us tonight. This is the first time that we've used this streaming service, so we are hopefully it will all go well, but just bear with us if we have a few technical difficulties at any point. So tonight we have two wonderful speakers lined up with some great topics, and there will be a chance for you guys to get involved and ask some questions. We can do that through two different ways, and at the end of each talk, we'll ask the questions for you to the speakers. So to ask your questions, you can do this via YouTube. So if you have an account, you can log in and you can ask your questions straight through YouTube, and they will come to us. If you don't have an account with YouTube, don't worry. We also have a Slido option, so you can use this on your mobile phone or a computer, however you're watching tonight. And if you type in www.slido.com and you use the code POS_LiveUni, all small letters, then this, and it should be on your screen now as well, so you should be able to see that. And this will take you to a place where you can ask your questions, and again, that will come through to us and we'll read them out for you. If you want to tweet us at all throughout the event, or tell us what you thought, or get involved, again, you can use Twitter, and the Twitter handles should be at your screen below as well. So that's enough about me. You're not here to listen to me tonight. You're here to listen to our wonderful speakers. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker. So we'll get Dan on the screen. Brilliant. Hi, Dan.
Good evening.
So this is Dr. Dan Hawcutt, and he is a senior lecturer and honorary consultant in pediatric clinical pharmacology. Not a short mouthful there, Dan. And he's at the University of Liverpool and Alder Children's Hospital. Now, we asked both our speakers for a fun fact about themselves, and Dan asked his 9-year-old twins to help him with this fun fact. And their facts were: one, has a cat that likes to eat cheese, and 2, is very good at lions. Dan, you sound like a man after my own heart. So I will hand over to Dan now to get our first talk up and going.
Excellent. Good evening. I really hope the screen's on the screen. I'm going to keep going because nobody's interrupted me. Fantastic. So thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm very much looking forward to this, and I've rarely ever...
Hi, Dan. We unfortunately can't hear you at the moment.
Oh, sorry. If I
Just bear with us.
Okay, is that me or you?
Is it because you're...
Alt tab. Hang on.
Brilliant, we've got you back, Dan.
Oh, okay, so I'll go back to the presentation. Right, okay, so there's always a technical hitch, isn't there? Good. Oh, hang on. Right, so hopefully you can hear me now properly and I can see the slides and we can get going. So anyway, welcome everyone. It's a chance to talk about what I do and hopefully make it entertaining, engaging and interesting, because it is. So I'm a person who cares about medicines in children. We want better, safer medicines for children. The question is, how do we do it? How do we get there? How do we know what we're doing? And that's what this talk's all about. So the first thing is you've got to contextualize pediatrics. So I'm a pediatrician. I think it's the most important thing in the world. But when it comes to healthcare and you think of somebody who's sick, you would normally come up with these kind of stock images that I lifted from the internet, but they were copyright appropriate. You know, you're thinking of the elderly, you're thinking of people in hospital. You're not usually thinking of children. And by and large, that's fair. Okay. Kids are a reasonably large part of the population. In Britain, it's about 15%. Ours is not the largest. In other countries, particularly in low and middle income countries, it's a bigger percentage. They are far healthier than adults. Okay. Alder, where I work, is one of the biggest children's hospitals in Europe. We are tiny compared to some of the big adult trusts that exist around the UK. And because they're healthy, they use less than their expected proportion of medicines. If you go to the over 90s, they use more than their expected proportion of medicines. These things even out. So you've got to look at pediatric medicine developing the fact that they're not a big market for the pharmaceutical industry, and there aren't many of them who are sick to test the medicines on in the first place, which adds to some of the problems we're going to go through here. But if we're going to work out how to get better, safer medicines for children, we need to know, is the drug working? So that's called efficacy. And how do we know if it's causing any harm or adverse drug reactions? And once we know those two facts, for an individual child with an individual problem, we can then start to form an opinion about risk and benefit, because everything is about risk and benefit. And that boils down to how much benefit do we need to get for this drug before we're willing to take a risk in prescribing it? And the second one is how much risk is too much risk regardless of any benefit we might get? And that's how I would tend to think of these questions. Now, going forward from this, the first question then is a drug working? How can we possibly tell this? And when we're thinking about children taking drugs, I've sort of divided it into some questions here, each of which leads to different thoughts and different things that need to be explored. The first one is, even if it has the same disease, same name, or it has the same symptoms, is the disease the same disease in children or adults? If you take adults, the most common cancers are breast and lung and bowel and prostate and stuff. If you take kids, it's acute lymphoblastic leukemia, it's Wilms tumor, it's so they're completely different. Even if you take a disease with the same symptoms, so you take asthma, I will argue till I'm blue in the face that the child on the left here, who is goes outside and wheezes when he comes across newly mown grass in springtime, although the wheeze is the same as the middle-aged coal miner who chain smokes, the underlying lung pathology and the damage done and the effect you would expect the drugs to have will be completely different. And you've got to put, even if labels are similar, you've really got to think about the underlying disease and damage to the organ systems that's going on. The second question I've got here is the patient actually taking the drug? Adherence is a complicated, massively involved science, and people like to help doctors. They tell them what they want to hear. So it's really hard if we ask a patient, are you taking your drug? They say yes, because I prescribed it. They want to be nice to me. That's fine. But we do have one advantage in the UK, and if you're not in the UK, I apologise, but the NHS has free prescriptions for all children, for all conditions. So actually, one of the barriers that affects many parts of the world is sheer affordability. And luckily, that's not something we have to deal with here. Having got past those things, the question if we're giving or prescribing a drug is, how is the drug going to work, is one of what we call pharmacokinetics. So what the body does to the drug. Does it go in the right amount? Do we need the same more or less to get the effect? And how do you get rid of it? There's a lot of molecular processes involved there. We can think about the enzymes that break a drug down or things. But at a really, just starting off level, this is an adult human. if you scale up a baby to adult human size, you start to see that actually there are some massive differences between them. The head is ginormous. And if you give the same amount of drug, even if you scale it up so that you're giving the right amount for the baby, who's an adult-sized baby, if you see what I mean, then you're going to get more drug in your head around your brain because there's more head to get your drug into. So you've got to think carefully about the distribution and the dose of the drug that you're giving. Question 6 I put here. Oh, the second thing is that kids are built differently from adults. Okay, so these tables show this bar chart shows the amount of what people are made of, and it boils down to roughly fat, water, and lean tissue, which is protein and carbohydrates on these graphs. And babies are soggy, elderly people are dry, young adults in the middle have the most lean tissue, the protein and carbohydrate bits, because they have muscle. So drugs, though, tend to be either love water, hydrophilic, or love fat, lipophilic, and they will go to those areas and stay there. So if you've got a very lipid-loving drug, then you might need to change the dose quite dramatically in a preterm infant because they haven't got a lot of lard to put the drug into. Whereas if you've got a water-loving drug, you might need more than you think because there's a lot more wetness in a newborn baby or a preterm infant. All these things come into play. And the last measure on this page is what's the best measure of, if we say there's a drug working, what do we mean by working? Okay, all these things come together and we get the dose, but is it actually doing what we think it's doing? And that's a really, really difficult question because you can think about a drug working in a number of different ways. And I've tried to simplify it. I spent an awfully long time thinking how I could pull this together. There are things that are easy to measure. So if you have asthma, and we'll stick with that example, then sometimes people get you to blow into a tube and they measure your respiratory function. It might be a peak flow meter, although they're not used as much anymore. It might be a proper spirometry in the hospital when you go for a visit and you get measures that are very technical, like FVC and FEV1. There might be things that are accurate and reproducible. There might be things that are important to the child and family. But when you break it down, these things are not always well aligned. Blood tests and urine tests are pretty accurate and pretty reproducible, but there are very few children who would volunteer for a blood test. Easy to measure is definitely not blood tests and urine tests when you think about young children, and even weight, I've put it on the list there, but it can take 3 members of staff to get an accurate weight off a toddler who really isn't that keen on it. And that's not easy or quick to do. And none of those things might matter to the child and the family, and that might not incentivize them to take the drug anyway. So working out what to measure to tell you if a drug is working is a complete science in itself. And sometimes you end up with some really strange measurements that come out of it. There's a horrible disease called Duchenne muscular dystrophy, awful thing. You end up with very weak muscles, they get damaged as you go along, and usually by about teenage years, the young boys who get it, it's a boy-only disease, this one, end up in wheelchairs, and they have a dramatically shorter life because their respiratory muscles struggle. In order to test the new drugs that are coming through for this, it's really exciting, there's new drugs, but in order to test those, on the younger kids, they do a 6-minute walk test. Now, I will pay good money to somebody who could get a 6-year-old to do 6 minutes of walking on task as far as they can. Not running, not skipping, not hopping, not going backwards, not distracted, not walking off to the window, just walking. It's really hard. A 1-minute walk test would be difficult, but 6 minutes, I salute the physios who do this. And that's before we even get to some of the more objective and reproducible measures like getting blood. When we're designing studies that will test drugs in children to see if they work and they're good, we will often need blood tests. We don't always. And ironically, the healthier a child is, the harder it can be to get a blood test. So if you are critically ill intensive care units, you will be unconscious, you will have medicines to keep you unconscious, and you will have lines in you. So I can't get as much blood as I want, but I can access, we can get blood when we need it. If you're a healthy 5-year-old who's in a trial for a vaccine, say, you're not going to let me near you, particularly if you've already had the vaccine and that was a needle as well. So it can be very, very challenging, and it can frustrate not just the researchers who think we really want these bloods, and also we're only allowed a limited volume, which is completely sensible and right, but means you have to be really careful how you design these things. But also it can infuriate the family because they view virtually any blood test as being intrusive and unnecessary and painful. And even when you've got agreement from ethics committees, from the family, and from the research community about how you're going to design a study that will involve blood tests, and you go to take them, you've then got to get the child to play along. There may be no direct benefit to this child participating in the study, and they will only join in if they're nice. And to be honest, I talked about physios being great earlier. Play specialists are the wonder that makes pediatric research go round, because they manage to make children see in a Mary Poppins style the fun and the entertainment, and not the fact they're getting a blood test. They're miracle workers. Okay, but then you end up with ethical dilemmas, which is probably why some of you are here. So you've got your kid, they've joined in a study, we're trying to work out if a drug works. We've answered all those pesky science questions at the start about how much we have to give and whether it's going to go in or not. But now, and they've signed up for the study. But what do you do when the 2-year-old who's in the study says, no, 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 no? Okay. They're 2. Do they really know what they're talking about? Well, we kind of have to assume they do to a point. Okay. Now, clearly, you're not going to ask, the 2-year-old will not have consented to be part of this study, but equally, we can't go around just randomly distressing them and making them sad, and we have to work them round to being part of what they're in, which is very difficult. It's much more straightforward if you have a 15-year-old who understood the study, had the information presented to them because this 15-year-old is neurologically normal, and just says, I don't want to do this anymore. That's fine. We respect that. If you don't want to do it, you are a completely free agent. You can sign out of it. It's really frustrating because now we have to find another 15-year-old probably to fill their place in the study, but they have autonomy. If they don't want to do it, they don't want to do it. And we wouldn't, but even if we thought we could, which we can't, we wouldn't want to. And then you get, the parent says, yes, you do. What if it's one of these horrible rare diseases that, this is their only chance to get what might be the next wonder drug? That might mean that their life is extended or they're cured. Now, in this, we respect the child's autonomy here. They're 15, they're sensible, but you can imagine the tensions in a household and the pressures that go on and the things that would happen in the background that we don't see that would be all around this. And then in the middle, what if you've got a 7-year-old who's completely fine and you've had a couple of goes and unfortunately they've got slightly difficult veins to cannulate? And they're quite calm and they're quite thin, but you've had a couple of goes and say, wait, just stop now. We have to go with that. As frustrating as it is clinically, if they were ill in hospital and we needed to give them a medicine, we would probably persuade them and keep going. But it's a much harder sell in clinical research where you're not allowed, there isn't that direct benefit necessarily to the patient. So you've got your outcomes, you know what you want to measure, you know how much drug to give. You then have to create a pediatric study. And as a clinical lead on a unit that tests drugs in children, I can tell you that it's very easy to create a useless pediatric study. And the way to do it is as follows. First of all, you take the adult study, which has probably already been done, and you just cut and paste it, but you just insert the word child at regular intervals. Okay. Secondly, you put in masses of inappropriate information for pre-pubertal girls about pregnancy prevention, which will put off every parent that you've ever seen. You then require massive blood volumes, or worse still, the right amount of blood volume, but done in tiny, frequent aliquots, so you have to keep sticking needles into children. We have a study on the books at the moment that wants 12 blood samples for a self-limiting condition. Unsurprisingly, recruitment is terrible. Okay? You add in some invasive or inappropriate tests, which you would do on an adult because adults put up with this kind of thing, but you would absolutely not do in kids. Or you ask the wrong people for information. So you ask the parents about the adverse drug reactions rather than the children. We had one study where the drug made your poo go white. It was kind of like 1970s dog poo, for those who remember that kind of era. Anyway, one of the company complained to us that our children were not taking the drug because nobody had commented on the fact their poo had gone white. And we looked at the forms, they'd only asked the parents of preteen children to comment on the stool colour. Well, I'm sorry, they're not going to know, and they're not going to ask, and the kids aren't going to tell them. So you could completely mess it up by doing that kind of thing. You can make them miss lots of school. That might get the kids on side, I grant you, but the parents are generally against that kind of thing. You absolutely remove all flexibility and make sure there's hundreds of regular visits, so there's no chance of them getting away for a summer holiday or a visit. And a particularly special one is where you try and ban chocolate for participants, but recruit them over Christmas and Easter. Put all that together and you'll have a genuinely useless pediatric study, and we see them. But you can do good ones, okay? You can work out if a drug works in a clinical trial, and it can be ethically and scientifically valid. And if you really care about the ethics and the philosophy of it, if you like, a group called the Nuffield Council on Bioethics had this fantastic report that's worth going to read. The only quibble I have with this entire report is that on the front cover, the giant purple boy who's got hair just a little bit like Bart Simpson, but not enough for copyright reasons, is taking his inhaler directly from the inhaler and hasn't got a spacer device involved. But apart from that, it's very good. Why do we do it in pediatrics? Why put ourselves through all this bother? Well, kids are nice and we want them to get better. And you know what? They're actually genuinely in it for the right reasons. This group did some interviews in Derby around a shopping centre asking kids about clinical trials. And when they got the information all together, they got all these wonderfully like kind of life-affirming quotes about people wanting to help other people and make sure that everything was all right. And children are basically very altruistic, which makes, offsets a lot of the problems that we've been discussing. I've been discussing. Okay, so that's how to work out if medicine works. How do we work out if it doesn't work? Well, we know that medicines can cause harm. Not just doesn't work, can actively cause harm. Okay, thalidomide everybody will have heard of. Focomelia, shortened limbs, very bad. Elixir of sulfanilamide you might not have done. This was a drug that poisoned about 90 children in the US and led directly to the formation of the Food and Drug Administration. So very important story. I could spend half a lecture on that, but I won't. But children have suffered at the hands of medicines. And they will continue to suffer. The problem is that you cannot learn all the possible harms from a drug from the clinical trials you need to set it up. It costs billions to make a drug. Now, I'm not crying for the pharma industry. They also spend billions on marketing. So, there's a balance here. But the science says that you can only really identify an adverse drug reaction in a population you're studying with confidence if you have 3 times the number of people take the drug as the frequency. So if it's a 1 in 2 adverse drug reaction, you've got to have 6 people take the drug. If it's 1 in 10, you've got to have 30. If it's 1 in 100, you've got to have 300. If it's 1 in 100,000 or 1 in a million, like some of the rare but really horrid side effects are, then suddenly you need 300,000, 3 million people to take the drug. And that's just impossible. There may not be that many people to take the drug ever in its lifespan in children, let alone recruiting them into a study to do it. So on the bottom here, these arrows, preclinical, phase 1, 2, 3 are the official phases of making a drug. Phase 4 is where we learn about it in real life, and that's reporting adverse drug reactions. Okay? Adverse drug reactions in children, the harms that medicines cause are different to adults. Well, some are the same, but you can have altered frequency. So sometimes the same thing happens, but more or less often. Okay? You can have altered severity. So you can have it worse for a given, reaction, or sometimes even better. Paracetamol, which is the top killer of people from drugs in this country, actually is slightly less harmful in younger children. And there are some adverse drug reactions that are completely unique in children. Some we thankfully don't see anymore, things like Reyes syndrome, which used to happen with aspirin in children, about 1 in a million, but also things like growth suppression. Adults only grow one way, and it's not going to be affected by steroids. Well, it will. You'll increase it, actually. That's a really silly. Anyway, and research has been done to look at how much harm these adverse drug reactions cause. This is very older data, I have to say, but it's the biggest and the best data there is that I know of. But about 3 in 100 kids who are admitted to hospital are because of adverse drug reaction. We should have avoided between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 of those. Once you're in, 1 in 5 to 1 in 6 kids has an adverse drug reaction as an inpatient, and there are things we can see that increase your likelihood. But if you go in hospital, you're more likely to have polypharmacy, which is lots of medicines. If you go in hospital, you're more likely to have an anaesthetic because that's where we do operations. So it's a problem, and it goes on. And we need to learn about it in order to be able to improve it. So actually, the audience participation part of this talk is around the Medicines and Healthcare Devices Regulatory Agency, the MHRA's Yellow Card Scheme. There is an app. If you know something in medicine, yourself, anybody else, anybody can report a suspected adverse drug reaction to them. And then we learn about possible harms. Anybody. It doesn't matter if it's you or somebody else who's taken the drug. It doesn't matter at all. You can report. From a pediatric point of view, though, we have lots of reports from doctors, nurses, pharmacists, lawyers, pharmaceutical industry about children. We have very few reports from children. I'm just checking the time. I'm a bit over, so I'm going to go very quickly now. We know that the information is not very good for children, and I have a fantastic medical student who sorted that out. And we now know that children will report different adverse drug reactions. So we're desperate to get children and young people to report more of their own ones, because I don't know if you're suicidal because of a drug. You do. And I can't see it like a kind of rash. So we need to try and encourage it. And there are surveys out for the MHRA who we're working with to try and improve this knowledge. So when you look at the overall risks and benefits, how awful is the disease? That'll tell you how much you really want to take the medicine. That question about how much benefit do we need? How much good does the drug then do? You know, is it a cure? Is it just 1% better? That's where the clinical trials come in that I've just talked about. What harms, what does the drug do? I put the wrong word in there. Could the drug do? That's the key word there. And we may not know that till after it's on the market. So there may be a period of prescribing where we don't know all the harms. And what do children and young people think, which is the last part of this puzzle that I've just talked about, and which is not always well captured in this work. And that will then vary from drug to drug and change over time. And if you think of it in the current context of COVID, you know, there's a lot of talk about COVID vaccines and children. You can apply all of those arguments directly and realize it's quite complicated, and it's not always very easy to work out what we should do next. Right, and that is me done.
Thanks, Dan. That was so interesting, and I just want to remind people, I'm just checking, I just want to remind people we're going to take some questions now. So if you have any questions for Dan on a topic that I think is so relevant, as you just mentioned, so relevant in today's world, if you have a question, remember you can either add it into the via YouTube, or you can do it by Slido. So remember, that's www.slido.com, and you can use the code POS_LiveUni to be able to ask your questions. And as they come through, I will ask them out to Dan. But I'm going to take a cheeky moment to ask my own question before, while giving everyone a chance to obviously ask their own. I read recently about how there's a lot more obesity in children these days, and I'm wondering, does that have a huge impact on some of the medicines that we already have that have obviously gone through all these clinical trials?
The short answer is yes. The longer answer is it depends on the medicine, and it depends on the reason you're giving it. If it's there are some medicines that there are starting to be studies coming out showing that you can have a different amount of good from the medicine and a different amount of harm, because we dose medicines in children often on body weight. So you get a special individual dose depending how much you weigh. And that, you know, if you are obese, you will get a bigger dose. Now that you might get more effect, you might get more side effects. And it depends then on the drug and the individual. But yes, it absolutely does. And when you're developing new drugs, we don't tend to include obese people in the studies, because you want the healthiest people, bar the particular reason you're giving them the drug. And so that, again, is a slight blind spot in the testing sometimes.
That makes sense. I'm going to move on to another question now. So this has come through. Do you think it is important to involve children when designing a study?
Or I go beyond the point, I say imperative. If we don't include children in the design, then we will design a study that children don't want to be in. There are children's young people's groups who are based in hospitals and based nationally. Generation R is the most famous one that I know of, who will look at research proposals and, in the way that children do, beautifully, smilingly rip it to pieces and tell you it's awful, but they'll tell you how to make it better. And when you come out at the end of it, you feel bruised and battered, and your adult ego is thoroughly humbled, but you end up with a much better study from it. And it's absolutely critical.
Yeah, no, I've done some work myself with some of the children groups, and they are inspiring, some of the work that they do. Another question for you. What do you think is the biggest challenge in carrying out pediatric studies?
I think there's a couple. It will depend on the area. So if you've got a rare disease, you've got to find enough kids with that problem to join in. You've got to resist the temptation to try and answer all the questions in the world, because you can't take all the blood you want to do all the other things. It's so context specific in terms of the disease and the drug. I think there's nothing inherently more difficult, I don't think, about a pediatric study than an adult one, other than we treat our population differently by necessity. And the science doesn't change, but the baggage that comes with it does, but in a good way. I can't think of a single biggest challenge, because I've just, like, lots of different things are sort of spinning around my head depending on the drug and the condition.
And I'll ask you just a final question now. Is medicine adherence generally higher in children than in adults? Oh, interesting.
I don't know that I could point you straight away to a figure or a highly cited, trustable reference that will give you that either way. My slightly experiential hat suggests it's probably the same, more or less, but for different reasons. So your access will be improved because you don't have to pay for your medicines. You've got an extra player at home reminding people to take the medicines, and generally speaking, in pediatrics, the parents and the doctors and the kids are all pointing in the same direction, which is very helpful. Against which, nobody wants their child to be on a medicine, and once it's done its job, people want them to be off it as quickly as possible. And so some medicines that might be more for the longer term, constipation treatments, like inhalers, you might find that you get a drop off because people are trying to reduce medicine taking in their children for the best reasons rather than through anything else. So I suspect it's broadly similar, but not for the same reasons.
Thanks, Dan. I'm going to be cheeky and actually I'll just ask one more question, because I've seen one come in and it's one that I'm also interested in. Are there any additional difficulties or precautions whilst working with children with disabilities or mental health issues?
So yes. So when you do a clinical research trial, clinical research study, you have to get it approved by a local or an ethics committee if you're dealing with NHS patients, so an NHS ethics committee, and their form that you fill in very much asks these kind of questions. Are you dealing with vulnerable populations? Children themselves are considered a vulnerable population, but do you have these other difficulties built in? A lot of it is around consent, and under 16s, unless they're competent, often don't consent to research studies, but you would have to have additional thoughts about, are we doing it in an appropriate location? If they're using wheelchairs, can they access to make sure we've got equity of access between the groups? If you're dealing with people who have marked mental health problems, have you got appropriately trained staff, mental health nurses or community mental health teams involved to make sure they understand what's going on? And the other thing for all research studies, every time you see a patient, consent isn't a one-off process. It should be every time you see them, are you still okay with being part of the study? Are you happy to continue? And that should always be the first words out of your mouth before hello, to make sure that people are still engaged with it properly and you're not coercing people. You have to make more effort to include these people to include people with mental health difficulties or physical disability or other things in your studies, but you will get a better study out of it if you're asking questions that affect those populations. So there are some difficulties in terms of logistics. There are some precautions in terms of ethical oversight and how you should set it up. but I think they are worthy as opposed to being bothersome.
I think that was a lovely answer. Thank you, Dan. Thank you for today's talk and obviously answering all the questions. It's been really fascinating topic, and I hope everyone else that's been listening has enjoyed it just as much as I have. So we're going to move on to our second talk of the night. So I'd like to welcome our second speaker. I will just get her on screen. Hi, look. So this is Dr. Laura Dean. Welcome. So Laura is a lecturer in global health at Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, with a particular interest in the use of participatory research methods with communities and people with disability to support the strengthening of health systems. Again, another mouthful for me to read, but sounds fascinating work. Most of Laura's work focuses in sub-Saharan Africa, notably Liberia, Nigeria, and Sierra Leone. Apologies. I promise I haven't been drinking that much tonight. Again, we asked Laura for an interesting fact about herself, and she told us a very interesting fact, that she is related to the last women who were burnt for witchcraft in the Shetland Isles. And this may be of entertaining value as Laura goes on to give her talk today. So I think on that bombshell, I'm going to hand it over to Laura to start.
Thanks a lot, Jenna. And for those of you that maybe can't see me, I'm Laura Dean, and I am a woman in my early 30s, and I'm talking to you today from my kitchen table with a relatively boring kind of white background. And I'm excited to be here talking with you all, and just wish it was in person, but hopefully we'll be back in Pint of Science in person soon. So I'm going to talk to you today about skin diseases, or sometimes you might see them called neglected tropical diseases, and they affect people living in poverty, often where there's poor environmental conditions and where health systems are weaker than the health system we're very privileged to have here in the UK in the NHS. Oh, let me just get to the right bit, and hopefully you'll see my slides moving. So if we take John, for example, John was a teacher living in rural Liberia during a period of conflict and fragility. And perhaps for those of you less familiar with Liberia, it's a small West African country which was founded in 1847 by descendants of freed slaves from the United States, the West Indies, and slave ships off the coast of West Africa. And as Liberia was formed, it displaced many indigenous African groups, and it created two divided societies, one which consists of settlers or Congo people, and one which consists of 28 indigenous African ethnic groups, which is often referred to as country people. And the social and ethnic tensions that this kind of settling caused remain in Liberia today. And it's widely thought that this is what's led to intense periods of conflict and a kind of 14-year civil war between 1989 and 2003. But women in Liberia have been really central to establishing peace. And in 2003, a comprehensive peace agreement was signed that led to Liberia electing Africa's first woman leader in President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf in 2005. But conflicts left a mark in Liberia and in other countries similar that are around it. And this has led to weak economic, health, and social systems. And these were further tested during the West African Ebola outbreak in 2014 to 2015. So what does that mean for people like John? Well, during the Civil War, John experienced severe itching on his skin, and that was caused by a disease called onchocerciasis, or river blindness. Onchocerciasis, or river blindness, is really easily treated by swallowing a single tablet called ivermectin. But for John, this tablet was not available, and despite trying to access healthcare on many occasions, shown by each marking on the wall here, he was unable to access the care he needed, and this eventually led to him going blind. But why is that? And in short, that's because of a weak health system. including the limited capacity of the health workforce to identify and diagnose disease or lacking tools to do that. Perhaps a lack of awareness in communities about different skin diseases, or belief systems that they're perhaps caused by witchcraft, and that can lead to stigma, which I'll explain a little bit more about later. Perhaps due to limited medicine supply, but also due to stigma experienced in the communities or by health workers, which means people don't want to access treatment and care. And so the exact burden of skin diseases affecting people like John is not really known because they haven't been mapped globally. But together, diseases like river blindness and other skin conditions can cause significant physical disability and lifelong impairments. The types of diseases we're talking about are things like lymphatic filariasis, which is a disease that's spread by mosquitoes. And if it's left untreated, it can lead to lower leg swelling, which is called lymphedema, or scrotal swelling in men, which is called hydrocele. And lymphatic filariasis is the fourth leading cause of disability worldwide, and it leads to 2 million impacted life years for affected persons. We're also talking about diseases like leprosy, which maybe many more of you have heard about because of its references within the Bible and other religious texts. But many people think this is an ancient disease that's been eliminated for a long time. But actually, it still affects over 200,000 people each year worldwide and is actively transmitted in countries like Liberia. Leprosy is caused by a bacteria called Mycobacterium leprae, which multiplies through the body, leading to nerve damage, damage to the respiratory tract and to the eyes. And finally, another disease we're talking about is Brulee Ulcer, or everlasting sore, which is an emerging infectious skin disease, also caused by a bacteria called Mycobacterium ulcerans, and it's known to be found in 33 countries and is identified in new places each year. The exact way that Brulee ulcer is transmitted from person to person is unknown, but more research is ongoing into this every day. And these are just a few of the main diseases that are often grouped together because of their impact on the skin. But these diseases also have many other shared impacts, such as stigma and discrimination experienced by people like John because of their physical appearance. And I'll talk more on that later. But before we do that, I'm just going to play a short video from our colleagues in Liberia, and they'll introduce a project called Redress, which I'll talk more about shortly. But we'll also hear some stories from people who are affected by skin diseases living in Liberia.
In 2016, the Ministry of Health Liberia developed a strategic plan for the integrated management of people affected by neglected tropical diseases. That plan was hailed globally as being one of the first strategic plans to integrate management of people affected by neglected tropical diseases. Since 2016, with the implementation of the plan, several gaps have been identified, including the lack of evidences to demonstrate the best approaches toward providing care to people affected by severe stigmatizing skin diseases.
The human resource factor is the fact that, for example, we train staff, and because they are not employed directly by government, they will leave for greener pasture. They will leave to go work for other institutions that leave gaps in the delivery of services.
This thing caused a very huge stigma on me, that stopped me from going to school, stopped me from going around friends. Even my girlfriend and myself, I was together, she had to leave me because of this condition, where when I wear trousers, before 30 minutes the trouser will get soaked and the wound will be smelling, so it can't permit me to sit among my friends. All my friends shy away from me, so it caused a very bad stigma for me. I won't associate with anybody. This effect is that upon high school graduation, I bear it up to 12 years, but to seek higher level of education to college, it won't permit me because of this condition. I won't go to school. everywhere. Even if I tend to go to school, when I go to school, it will get worse on me. I sit down with my friends, I will start getting that bad odor from myself. My friends will start inhaling it. They will start throwing talks at me. Even when I'm walking, people who know my condition will start looking at my foot. Once they see my trousers wet, my feet, it looks very bad on me. It stopped me from going to school 9 years. Upon my graduation in 2012.
But again, sometimes we don't have the supplies to provide the services that are needed to the clients that are identified. Like, for example, Brulee Ulcer cases are identified, we don't have the resources. Not necessarily the resources, but specifically the drugs or the medicine and medical supplies that are needed.
I was a small boy. I got leprosy. And the leprosy, because my community and my village noticed about it, I really suffered from the people. One thing they did was that I could not go anymore on the football field or other places to play with my friends. Yes, for me, I work already with the disability people, which is the leprosy people, and some BU can even go into a problem that they have to amputate them. The problem we're having is how to get them back home. When you treat them, because all around here, you can find out that they are stuck in all the communities here, where they will find a way to squeeze themselves somewhere where people will accept them. Normally, when you are with leprosy and you get mad, you go home, people don't accept you.
I'm happy that Redress came in to look after this stigma that have been causing serious problems to we young people in Lofa County and Liberia as large.
We are designing an intervention package which will be piloted in Liberia, and we anticipate that at the end of our intervention packages, our research, we will have developed an optimal model toward the delivery of services to people with SSDs that will be inclusive of the views of stakeholders across all levels of the health system, including patients and their family members. We envision an optimal model which will be effective, efficient, sustainable, accessible, available, and gender sensitive toward the delivery of SSD services in Liberia. A package that will be replicable to other parts of Liberia, West Africa, and beyond Africa. Thank you.
So as you will have heard in Emmanuel and John's stories, people affected by skin diseases experience stigma and discrimination in different ways. This might be enacted stigma, which mean that actions of discrimination or by individuals or communities. So Emmanuel talked about being excluded from school. Internalized stigma, where individuals often withdraw because of the negative feelings that they have about themselves. Anticipated stigma, where individuals think they're likely to experience discrimination based on their skin disease or health condition and so hide themselves. Or hereditary stigma, where individuals or children within the household may experience stigma because of living or being linked to somebody who's affected by a skin disease. And we've heard a lot of different stories from men today, but it's important to note that stigma interacts with other things about us. So our age, our gender, how rich we are, or perhaps other health conditions that we live with. And that shapes our experiences, or people with skin diseases' experiences of stigma. And finally, the places where we live also shape how we're stigmatized. So we might live in an area where health services are particularly ignored or weak, and these might constrain our opportunities for health and well-being. Stigma can often lead to significant impacts on people's mental health, and in some cases can trigger mental health conditions. For example, if someone experiences violence as a result of a skin disease, this can often lead to psychological distress. And this can trigger experiences of depression, anxiety, or perhaps create a dependency on the use of alcohol. And when society further excludes people because of these mental health conditions, we might describe that they have a psychosocial disability. And the link between mental health conditions and skin diseases is increasingly a focus in research. And recent studies have found that 70% of people with lymphedema in Togo are at risk of depression. 20% of people with lymphatic filariasis in Nigeria experience depression. And 68.5% of people with lower leg lymphedema in Rwanda have reported depressive symptoms. And it's important to note that these prevalences of mental health conditions in people affected by skin diseases are much higher than in the general population, and compared to people with kind of other chronic health conditions such as HIV. But it is easy to think about people like John, and Emmanuel as passive victims or sufferers. But within Redress, which is the program that Zila talked about earlier on the video, we use what's described as a participatory action research approach to address some of the challenges in the Liberian health system and communities that are impacting the management of stigmatizing skin diseases and the lives of people like John, and Emmanuel. This participatory action research approach means working with people affected, health workers and communities to understand and reflect on challenges they're experiencing, to develop solutions together, to test and improve these solutions, and then work about how we make sustainable change in Liberia and in the health system. These approaches rely on us working in equal partnership with communities and affected persons, and they rely on research methods and approaches that are inclusive. And one method that I wanted to share with you today, which we're using in Redress, is photo voice. And this simply means sharing experiences through photographs. So firstly, I wanted to explain the importance of peer researchers within Redress. And peer researchers are people like John who are living with skin diseases, as well as health workers. And we particularly work with what are called community health workers, who are essential to health systems all over sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, and indeed here in the UK. And they're people that connect communities with their health system. And in Liberia, they're often volunteers who are chosen by their local communities to try and extend health services in particularly rural areas. And we work with these peer researchers and we train them on different research methods and processes to try and support action and change within different communities. And so people affected with skin diseases often rely on faith and traditional healers, who hopefully you'll understand a bit more about in the coming slides. And they often support people in communities, particularly where health systems are weak. And so to better understand the role and perspective of traditional and faith healers in managing skin diseases, our peer researchers have worked with them to use cameras to document and share their experiences from their practice. And so what this involves is faith healers and traditional healers taking photos related to issues that are important to them for 2 weeks in their communities. Individual discussions were then held with traditional and faith healers on the meaning of their photographs, and these were conducted by our peer researchers. Traditional and faith healers then picked 10 to 20 photos that represent key issues to them and were brought together in groups to discuss their photos. And through exhibitions and dialogue with people affected, traditional and faith healers and other health workers, we're now working together to develop solutions to some of the challenges that they've identified. I just wanted to share with you a few photos from this process. And so this is one of the photos from one of the faith healers. And this photo really highlights the importance of alternative forms of healing and treatment when managing skin diseases in countries like Liberia. And what you can see here is the importance of prayer in managing the experience. Other alternative forms of treatment are also necessary, particularly where the health system is weaker or not accessible. And so what this photo from one of the traditional healers was trying to show is that where people affected by skin diseases can't access the health system, they also play a role in kind of managing and wound care for affected persons. And finally, this photo from one of our traditional healers emphasizes the kind of variety of belief systems about the causes of disease in many Liberian communities. So even when diseases may be treated at the hospital, there's certain parts of disease that have to be treated through spiritual practice or with spiritual medicines. And so what they wanted to show us here was there were some parts of the sickness that the hospital couldn't treat or improve. And so they were using traditional medicines to treat those parts of the sickness. And you can see from this traditional healer that he was particularly happy in his work and seeing positive change in his patients. The other thing I wanted to highlight to you today is the importance that faith healers and traditional healers play in providing psychosocial support and counselling and forms of lay talk therapies in communities. And so what this photo quite powerfully shows is where one faith healer experienced having to intervene because one woman who was living with skin disease was experiencing suicidal thoughts. And so he counselled her and talked to her and took her home to try and support her through that mental health condition. And then this final photo shows a trauma healing class, which is quite common in Liberia. And this is where faith healers talk to people who have experienced trauma, either because they're sick or perhaps as underlying traumas resultant from the 14 years of war. And they bring community members together to have talk and dialogue to try and support them through different experiences. So we're currently working with faith healers and traditional healers to use some of these strategies that they're already using to begin to understand how we can support them to work better with the kind of more formal or medical health system to support people affected by skin diseases. And this is just one part of working together with communities that's central to Redress. And we also continue to work with other areas of the health system to try and strengthen supply systems or health worker training so we can contribute to reducing stigma, social exclusion and poverty associated with different skin diseases. So I'll stop talking there and say thank you for listening. But I guess if you could take one thing away from the talk today, I really hope it's to acknowledge that there is a lot of pain and suffering that people with skin diseases face all over the world, but also they present immense capacity to develop their own solutions and direct change in their own health systems. And research that's kind of designed with people and for people, we can have much more impact in kind of addressing these issues. And then just to say that in Redress, we're really interested in talking more about our work within and around Liverpool. And also we'd love to hear from you about how we can share more. So do check out our website and get in touch if you'd like any more information. So thanks a lot.
Thanks, Laura. Really, really interesting talk and very powerful, particularly hearing from the patients and the conditions and everything. So thank you so much for sharing that with us today. Just a quick reminder, I know that we're coming up to time and I apologise that because of our technical difficulties at the beginning, I think we're running over slightly, but we will take a few questions if people want to kind of stay with us for a little bit longer. Don't forget you can submit your questions via YouTube or using Slido. The details are just below and it's very easy to use. You don't have to sign up or anything. I'm going to start us off with a question whilst we just gather questions from the audience. How do you think we can go about identifying, better identifying people with these skin diseases?
Yeah, thanks, Jenna. I think it's tricky because often for many of the reasons that I talked about in my presentation, people are often hidden away because of stigma. But what we can work with kind of traditional and faith healers, and that's why I chose to emphasize in my presentation today, because they're often the first point of call for many people with skin diseases. So we can work with them and also with community health workers who I talked about loosely to train them to look for changes in people's skin and look at the development of kind of simple tools to support them to do that. One of the main challenges with kind of doing that is a lot of skin diseases have been researched on kind of white skin, And so trying to find tools and resources that show what it looks like on different skins is quite challenging. And so Google have just started developing an app around that, and other kind of non-governmental organizations have, but often finding pictures of what these diseases look like on different skin types, it is quite challenging.
That's really interesting. And I guess that's quite relevant as well, not just in Africa, but around the world. And I know that was definitely an interesting point that was raised even through COVID, things like COVID toe and things like that, people were being asked to come forward. So that's a really interesting point. Move on to a question from our audience member. What is the best way for richer countries to help?
Yeah, that's quite a difficult question to answer, I guess. I think one thing I would say is that I think working in health systems and the COVID pandemic's really kind of highlighted this as well. I think there's a kind of two-way process of learning that needs to happen. I think we in the NHS and in the UK can learn a lot from kind of countries like Liberia in the way they manage their health system and maybe do things differently. I think in terms of financial support is obviously the one of the largest barriers to developing health systems in a lot of the settings where I work. And so maintaining that financial support, perhaps at the moment lobbying your MP to do that, would be really important. And also kind of making sure that in countries like Liberia or other places where we work, that they're actually in control of how their resources are spent and how aid resources are spent there as well.
Thanks, Laura. I know that was a trickier question. So I am conscious of time. So I'm just going to ask one final question. Has there been tensions between you or your team and the faith healers, or have they been very supportive and welcoming into the communities where you're doing this work?
Thank you. That is a really interesting question, and I think it's one of the reasons why we've chosen to design the study in this way, because obviously some traditional and faith healing practices could be seen as harmful in communities, but you can't obviously ignore what they're doing because they're such a huge part of people's everyday life and how people are supported where we're working. So by using the kind of photo voice and other participatory methods, what we've tried to do is start to build a relationship with them to try and kind of break down those tensions and build trust, so that as we move forward through kind of what we call intervention development phases of our study, that's trust there, and trust is there, and we can have kind of an open dialogue about what works for everyone in trying to kind of support affected persons.
Thanks, Laura. I think that's a really powerful message to end on, is that having that two-way conversation is important. And I think that's, part of Pint of Science, isn't it? The reason we want to hold these and allow researchers to come and give talks to the public is, again, to allow this great conversation and the questions that have come through. So thank you to our audience as well. I'm just going to bring Dan back on screen. Both of you, thank you for taking part tonight. I hope the audience have really enjoyed the talks, and thank you obviously for everyone that's attended. We've had some great comments and feedback that come through, so hopefully that's been all well received. Thank you for all of you for bearing with us with some of the technical difficulties. And now, go and enjoy a drink as if you were in the pub. I certainly will be myself. If you do want to tweet us or about the event, or if you want to learn about more events that are similar to this one, follow us on Twitter. We try and host different events, not just Pint of Science, throughout the year. So you might be interested in some of those. But that's all from me, and thank you both once again.